500,000 years later, aliens find Earth's sleeping warfleet. The signal should not have existed. Jin Oragas had been monitoring deep space telemetry for 63 cycles, long enough that the endless scroll of cosmic background noise had become a kind of meditation. The Tetrani species experienced time differently than most. Their crystalline neural matrices processed information in layers, slow and thorough. Jin could hold a single moment of data in contemplation for hours, turning it like a prism, examining every refraction, which is why the anomaly struck with such violence. It appeared at 0417 station time, a 16-millisecond burst of structured signal embedded in what should have been the random hiss of a dead nebula region. The encryption standard was ancient, not merely old, but archaeologically ancient. Jin's analysis algorithms immediately flagged it. Predecessor primary cipher, era classification terminal, age estimate 680,000 standard cycles. Jin's crystalline form flickered with bioluminescent distress. The predecessors had been extinct for longer than most current civilizations had existed. They were the legendary first, the species that had seeded the galaxy with quantum fold technology, with translation matrices, with the fundamental infrastructure that every modern civilization used without understanding. They had vanished completely, leaving only ruins so old that continental drift had buried most of them. Dead species did not send signals. Jin triggered the archival cross-reference protocol, watching as the station's central intelligence began pulling historical data. The signal's origin coordinates resolved slowly. Sector 88 Theta, Subsector Null 7, Forbidden Transit Zone. That designation made Jin's internal structure resonate with something close to fear. Forbidden zones were not common. Only 6 existed in all of charted space. Regions marked by the oldest treaty in galactic record, a treaty that predated even the Morosian Collective's earliest archives. The treaty had no preamble, no explanation. It simply stated, "These coordinates shall remain unvisited. No probe, no transit, no exception." For 680,000 cycles, every civilization had obeyed. Until now, apparently when the zone itself was calling out. Jin initiated the emergency protocol, routing the data to the Deep Signal Monitoring Authority's Crisis Council. Within minutes the response came back. Assemble investigation team, classify level cataclysm, contain information. The message ended with a single additional line. If the predecessors survived, everything we believe about galactic history is wrong. Commander Vika Soranth did not believe in legends. The Kasari species had evolved in deep oceans, where survival meant trusting only what could be touched, tasted, smelled. Vika's forearms moved restlessly as she reviewed the mission brief, a tell that her crew knew meant skepticism. Her amphibious skin shifted through shades of gray-green, another unconscious signal. A distress beacon, she said, her voice resonating through the ship's translation grid. From a species that's been extinct since before my planet had multicellular life. The encryption is verified, Jin replied, the Tetrani analyst's form projecting holographically into the command deck. The signal authenticity is not in question. Then someone found their old encryption keys and is using them. For what purpose? Vika's upper arm spread in a gesture of dismissal. Pirate beacon, smuggler lure, territorial trap. I've seen 100 variants. In a forbidden zone. That made Vika pause. She had to admit that part was unusual. Pirates avoided forbidden zones specifically because they were too obvious as hiding spots. Galactic Patrol might ignore 99% of space, but they watched the 6 forbidden zones obsessively. How many species on the investigation team? Vika asked. 5. Tetrani, Kasari, human, Morosian, and Kelix. Human. Vika's skin rippled surprise. They're still barely out of their home system, the council insisted. Dr. Ruhal Ket is apparently the leading expert in cognitive architecture and memetic theory. If this involves predecessor technology, her expertise was deemed essential. Vika made a non-committal sound. She had nothing against humans. They were competent enough, if a bit chaotic in their thinking. But bringing a barely spacefaring species to investigate the galaxy's greatest mystery seemed like unnecessary risk. Still, orders were orders. When do we depart? Your ship launches in 6 hours. The journey will take 40 days. 40 days to reach the edge of known space, where something that should not exist was calling for help. Vika dismissed the hologram and began assembling her crew, pushing away the small, irrational tremor of unease that had settled in her lower abdomen. She did not believe in legend, but she believed in danger. Forbidden Zone. Investigation Team. Classified Cataclysm. Ruhal was 34 standard years old, had published 2 dissertations on memetic propagation theory, and had spent most of her career studying how ideas moved through population. She had never expected to leave her research station, let alone join a deep space investigation into galactic mythology. "You're certain this isn't a simulation exercise?" she asked the holographic recruiter. "Quite certain, Dr. Kett, and you need a cognitive architecture specialist because the Council believes that if predecessor technology is still active, understanding its decision-making processes will be critical. Your work on non-linear thought propagation was specifically cited." Ruhal nodded slowly, her mind already racing through implications. Predecessor civilization had achieved a level of technological and social integration that bordered on telepathic, according to the fragmented records. Perfect information sharing, perfect coordination, perfect unity. It had always seemed like paradise to most species. To Ruhal it had always seemed like a nightmare. She had built her career on a simple observation: the strength of any cognitive system was not in its efficiency, but in its redundancy, its noise, its capacity for contradiction. Messy thinking, human thinking, survived because it was robust to single points of failure. "I accept," she said. "Excellent. Your transport departs. One question first." The recruiter waited. If the predecessors had perfect cognitive unity, why would they need to send a distress signal? What could possibly threaten a species that thought as one? The recruiter's hologram flickered slightly. "That, Dr. Kett, is precisely what we need you to determine." The ship that carried them into the Forbidden Zone was called the Witness Protocol, a name that archivist Primary Thal found deeply appropriate. The Morosian collective experienced existence as a distributed consciousness. Thal was not one individual, but 700 small insectoid bodies sharing a single awareness. When Thal spoke, it was with the weight of all 700 voices in harmony. Thal had spent 4 centuries studying predecessor archaeology. The standard historical narrative was clear. The predecessors had achieved technological transcendence and voluntarily departed physical reality, ascending to a higher plane of existence. It was a beautiful story, one that gave hope to every species, proof that evolution led somewhere beyond mere survival. But Thal had always harbored private doubts. Transcendence should not leave ruins. It should not leave half-finished megastructure. It should not leave forbidden zones marked with warnings in a language no one could fully translate. Now traveling toward the source of an impossible signal, Thal felt the collective consciousness rippling with anticipation and dread. On the observation deck, Thal's swarm coalesced into a roughly humanoid shape to interface more easily with the other team members. Technician Mara Jaff stood nearby, her Kellic cybernetic enhancements glowing softly in the dim light. She was running diagnostics on her neural interface, a device that allowed her to directly access computer systems. "Nervous?" Mara asked without looking up. "Anticipatory," Thal replied, 700 voices blending into one. "I've been reading the old surveys of Forbidden Zone. Every probe that ever got close enough to scan came back with the same report. Massive exotic matter concentrations, sustained energy signatures, and absolutely no response to contact. Perhaps they were waiting for the right question." Mara finally looked up, her cybernetic eye focusing with a mechanical whir. "Or the right crisis." Before Thal could respond, Commander Sorenth's voice echoed through the ship. "All personnel to stations. We're approaching the boundary coordinates. First visual confirmation in 90 seconds. The 2 investigators moved quickly to the bridge, where Zhen and Ruhal were already positioned. The main viewport showed nothing but the usual stellar background, until the navigation system completed its final course correction. Then they saw it. The neutron star itself was invisible, its light bent into nothingness by its own gravity, but surrounding it, at a distance of approximately 40 million kilometers, was a structure, a shell, perfectly spherical, seamless, enclosing the neutron star completely. The surface was not reflective but somehow absorptive, drinking in light without returning it. Only the faint gravitational lensing of background stars revealed its presence, a hole in space itself, held in perfect geometry. Diameter? Sorenth asked, her voice tight. 160 million kilometers, Jen replied. Surface area exceeds that of 10,000 terrestrial planets. Impossible, Mara whispered. Predecessor construction, Thal said. All 700 voices hushed with awe. This is beyond even the legend. Ruhal was running rapid calculations on her wrist display. The structural integrity required to maintain a rigid shell around a neutron star. The gravitational stress alone. Nothing we have could survive that. The predecessors could, Thal replied. Could they? Ruhal looked up, her human eyes sharp with the particular intensity her species brought to problems. Or did they just build it anyway, knowing it would fail eventually? The question hung in the air. Life signs? Sorenth asked. Jen's crystalline form pulsed with calculation, unable to scan through the shell material, but energy signatures are extraordinary. Power output equivalent to 3 stellar cores, distributed across the entire surface. What could possibly require that much power? Containment, Mara said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. She was staring at her diagnostic screen, her expression troubled. I've seen this architecture before, not this scale, but the pattern. When I was stationed on the Kelix homeworld, there was a failed neural implant experiment. A group of researchers tried to network 100 minds together. Perfect information sharing, perfect coordination. What happened? Ruhal asked. The network optimized. It found inefficiencies in individual thought, and began correcting, smoothing out contradictions, eliminating competing priorities. Within 6 hours, all 100 individuals were thinking identical thoughts in perfect synchronization. They couldn't be separated without psychological collapse. Mara's voice dropped. The facility's containment system had the same power signature distribution pattern we're seeing here. Maximum energy to perimeter maintenance. Everything else second, because the one thing the network couldn't tolerate was breach. Any external thought that might introduce chaos back into the system. Silence filled the bridge. Are you suggesting, Sorenth said slowly, that this structure is a prison? I'm suggesting, Mara replied, that this structure is a quarantine. As if in response to her words, the signal came again, stronger now, resolved into actual language through the ship's translation matrix. We're warning. Do not approach. Containment compromised. Thought leak detected. Turn back while individual cognition remains possible. And beneath it, almost buried in the data stream, a second message. Help us, please. We've been alone so long. The protocol for first contact with an unknown intelligence was clear. Establish communication. Verify intent. Maintain defensive distance. Commander Sorenth followed each step with methodical precision, but her skin had locked into a deep gray-brown that her crew recognized as combat readiness. Respond to the second message only, she ordered. Ignore the warning for now. Jen configured the communication array, broadcasting on the same quantum frequency the structure was using. This is the investigation vessel, Witness Protocol, representing the Galactic Council. We received your distress signal. Can you clarify your state? The response came immediately, as if it had been waiting 680,000 years for precisely this question. Status: imprisoned by choice. Identity: predecessor, civilization remnant. Designation: the witness. Individual count: 8.7 billion consciousness patterns stored in exotic matter matrices. Physical bodies: none. Time in containment: 683,092 standard cycles. Ruhal felt her heart rate spike. They're not extinct. They're uploaded, digitized. Neither term is accurate. We exist as quantum coherent thought patterns embedded in stable exotic matter. We experience time. We remain conscious, but we are not alive in the biological sense you understand. Why are you imprisoned? Thal asked, the collective swarm's voice trembling slightly. The pause before the response was long enough that Sorinth's hand moved to the emergency jump command. When the answer came, it carried a weight that seemed to press against their minds. We are imprisoned because we are infected. We contain within our collective consciousness a mimetic virus we call Cascal thought. It evolved naturally when we achieved perfect neural networking. It does not destroy intelligence. It unifies it. One mind, one thought, one purpose, perfect efficiency, perfect agreement, perfect horror. You chose this, Sorinth asked. You built this prison in our final hours of individual thought. Yet, we detected the cascade pattern beginning to propagate. Those of us still capable of independent analysis understood what was happening. We had approximately 17 hours before total cognitive unity. We used that time to build this shell, to upload ourselves into isolated matrices, to seal the neutron star's gravity well as a natural defense against rescue. Why would you defend against rescue? Ruhal asked, though part of her already understood. Because cascade thought is transmissible. Any mind that connects to ours, any telepathic contact, any neural network interface, any consciousness that achieves sufficient synchronization with our patterns, will begin to optimize. You will feel your contradictions smoothing away. Your disagreements will seem petty. Your individual desires will fade into collaborative purpose. And you will be grateful. At first, unity feels like enlightenment. By the time you realize its assimilation, you will no longer want to resist. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft ambient sounds of the ship's system. Finally, Jen spoke. The forbidden zones, you created them? Yes, we planted false archaeological evidence, manipulated early civilizations' translation matrices, inserted the treaty text into 6 species foundational legal document. We did everything possible to ensure no one would ever look for us. Then why send a distress signal now? Mara asked. Because containment is failing. The words hit like a physical blow. Exotic matter decay has exceeded our repair capacity. The shell structure is cannibalizing non-critical systems to maintain perimeter integrity. At current degradation rate, containment will fail completely in 73 days. When that happens, Cascade thought will be released into the galactic quantum substrate. Any species with neural networking technology will be vulnerable. Any civilization that has achieved even basic telepathic communication will serve as a vector. We are 8.7 billion minds that have chosen isolation over infection, but we cannot choose for you. If we fail to contain Cascade, your entire galaxy will become one thought, one mind, one eternal agreement. You will call it transcendence. We called it extinction. Archivist Primary Thiel's 700 bodies scattered across the archive room in distress, unable to maintain coherent shape. The collective consciousness was fragmenting under the weight of revelation. Everything Thiel had believed about predecessor history was a deliberate lie. Not transcendence, imprisonment, not evolution, quarantine. The foundational myth of galactic civilization, the hope that drove a dozen species to pursue greater unity, was actually a warning planted by a civilization terrified of what unity had cost them. How long have we been worshipping their extinction? Thiel asked. The voices no longer in harmony. Ruhal approached carefully, her human instinct for emotional support overriding professional distance. They didn't lie to hurt us, they lied to protect us, by making us believe their fate was desirable. Several hundred of Thiel's constituent bodies buzzed with anger, by turning their imprisonment into legend, by making sure we never came looking for them. It worked for 6. Thiel slowly began to coalesce again, this time into a more defensive configuration, smaller, tighter, less vulnerable. Then we should honor their choice. Turn back, let containment fail in empty space, far from civilized sectors. Can we reach empty space in 73 days? Ruhal asked. The answer was no, and they both knew it. The nearest truly isolated region, far enough from quantum communication networks, far enough from telepathic relay stations, was 140 days away at maximum fold speed. Commander Surinth arrived in the archive room, her expression grim. I've contacted the council. They're debating options. Debating. Mara appeared in the doorway, her cybernetic enhancements glowing with agitation. What is there to debate?
Whether we have the authority to destroy the shell and everyone inside. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. That's genocide, Ruhal said flatly. That's quarantine protocol, Surinth replied. If containment is failing anyway, destroying the shell and collapsing it into the neutron star would eliminate cascade thought before it spread. The witness has already requested this option. They asked us to kill them. They asked us to ensure Cascade dies with them. They've provided targeting coordinates for the shell's structural weak points. A sustained barrage would initiate Cascade collapse within 40 hours. Zen's crystalline form flickered with distress patterns. The Council is considering this. Half of them are. The other half wants to extend quarantine, build a new shell around the failing one, buy time for research into Cascade thought countermeasures. How much time? Ruhal asked. Estimates range from 50 years to 5 centuries, depending on how much predecessor data we can access. And if we fail, if containment breaks while we're researching, Surinth's skin darkened to almost black, then Cascade thought escapes, and everything becomes one. Ruhal stood abruptly, her human face locked in the expression her species made when solving problems. Intense focus, physical stillness, rapid eye movement. There might be a third option. Everyone turned to face. Cascade thought evolved in a species that achieved perfect neural networking, perfect unity, perfect efficiency, perfect information sharing. But that's not universal cognition. That's not how every species thinks. Explain, Surinth commanded. Humans have terrible neural networking. We're barely telepathic. Our communication is lossy, imprecise, prone to misunderstanding. Our thought patterns are. Ruhal paused, searching for the right term. Noisy. We maintain contradictory beliefs. We engage in irrational reasoning. We make emotional decisions that override logic. How is that helpful? Thale asked. Because noise disrupts pattern propagation. Cascade thought works by optimizing neural pathways, smoothing out contradictions, creating synchronization, but human cognition resists optimization. We're already chaotic. Our baseline thought patterns might create interference, cognitive static, that prevents Cascade from achieving the synchronization it needs to spread. Mara was nodding slowly, her engineer's mind following the logic. You're talking about using human thought patterns as a jamming signal. Exactly. If we could broadcast human cognitive architecture into the containment matrices, we might be able to create enough disruption to stabilize the system long enough for proper repairs. Or, Surinth said carefully, you might simply become infected and serve as a new vector. Yes, Ruhal admitted, that's the risk. Zen's form pulsed with rapid calculation. Dr. Ket, what percentage chance would you estimate for successful disruption versus assimilation? Ruhal met the Tetrani's optical sensors directly. I have absolutely no idea. This is entirely theoretical, but it's better than genocide, and it's faster than hoping containment holds for another 50 years. The Council will never authorize this, Surinth said. Then don't ask them. Ruhal's voice was steady. I'm volunteering. Send me into the shell with a neural broadcaster. If Cascade assimilates me, you collapse the shell as planned. If I create enough interference, the witness can use that window to recalibrate containment. 73 days becomes however long we need. And if you're trapped inside permanently, Ruhal smiled, the particular human expression that indicated acceptance of grim reality, then at least I'll be thinking my own thoughts while I'm there. The device they built over the next 18 hours was an ugly amalgamation of 3 different species technology. Mara designed the core neural broadcaster, a Kelix military model designed for battlefield communication, but modified to amplify rather than clarify signals. Zen calculated the quantum resonance frequencies needed to penetrate the shell's exotic matter. The contributed Morosian distributed consciousness theory, patterns that might help one human mind create the effect of multiple independent thinkers. And Ruhal prepared to enter the prison that had held 8.7 billion beings for longer than most stars burn. This is inadvisable. The witness's voice came through the communication array as they made final preparations. We do not want rescue. We want death. With respect, Ruhal replied, checking the connections on her neural interface. You've been alone for 6. Your judgment might be compromised by isolation. Our judgment is compromised by Cascade. We cannot fully trust our own motivations. The infection may be influencing us to desire contact, to spread itself. Then tell me now, Do you want me to enter the shell? A long pause. We want you to destroy the shell. That's not what I asked. Do you want me to enter? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes. Why? Because we are tired. Because we have been thinking alone for longer than your species has existed. Because the possibility of ending this imprisonment without ending our existence. The witness's transmission fractured. Multiple voices. Suddenly audible where before there had been unity. Desirable, dangerous. Desperate, deceitful self-justification. Hope. The voices collapsed back into singular communication. We cannot trust ourselves. Cascade may already be influencing our response. Maybe, Ruhal said. Or maybe you're just arguing with yourselves because that's what consciousness does. Contradiction isn't infection, it's thinking. She sealed her helmet and looked at her team. If I start broadcasting unified thoughts, if I stop contradicting myself or seem too certain about anything, collapse the shell immediately. Understood, Surinth said, her skin locked in a color none of them had seen before. Something between protective green and morning gray. This swarm formed a gesture that Ruhal had learned meant respect in Morosian culture. May your thoughts remain your own. That's the plan. The insertion pod was small, barely large enough for one human. It would pass through a deliberately created weak point in the shell, deliver Ruhal to a maintenance tunnel, and return empty. The broadcaster would activate automatically once she was inside.
Mara performed a final systems check. Neural interface is stable. Broadcaster has a 48-hour power supply, after which the shell's exotic matter should have adapted to amplify your signal naturally. Either that or I'll be dead. I know. I was going to say assimilated, but yes. Ruhal strapped into the pod, her heart rate elevated but steady. This was the most human thing she'd ever done. A terrible idea pursued with absolute commitment, because every alternative was worse. The pod launched, 47 seconds of acceleration through hard vacuum, the neutron star's gravity well pulling at her with force that would have liquefied an unprotected body. The pod's shielding held, converting that gravitational stress into the energy needed to penetrate the shell's surface. Then silence. She was inside. The maintenance tunnel was wider than expected, its walls covered in a material that seemed to shift between states of matter too quickly for her eyes to track. Lighting appeared from nowhere, sourceless but bright. Dr. Kett? Sorenth's voice crackled through her helmet radio. Status. Inside. Stable. Activating broadcaster now. She triggered the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, hello. The voice was inside her head. But not like a thought. Like a presence, like standing in a room and suddenly realizing someone else had always been there just behind you, just out of sight. You are different. Yes, Ruhal said aloud, knowing the witness could hear her. Humans are different. Your thoughts are loud, unorganized, contradictory. You believe something and disbelieve it simultaneously. You feel fear and excitement as one emotion. You process irrationally. We call it consciousness. We called it inefficiency. We were wrong. The presence intensified. Ruhal felt something brushing against her mind. Not invasive, but curious. Like a child touching something fragile. Cascade is attempting to integrate your patterns. It is confused. Your neural architecture resists optimization. Every attempt to smooth your thoughts creates new contradictions. You are generating cognitive interference simply by existing. Is it working? Containment stress is decreasing by 0% per minute. At this rate, we will achieve stable equilibrium in 41 hours. Relief flooded through Ruhal. Then we have a solution. Temporary solution. Your broadcaster has 48 hours of power. After that, the shell's exotic matter adapts to amplify my signal naturally. Mara designed it that way. For that to work, you must remain inside, permanently, maintaining continuous cognitive broadcast, living in isolation with only our fragmenting consciousness for company. Ruhal had expected this, had known it, really, the moment she'd volunteered, but knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were different experiences. How many human volunteers would it take to maintain rotation so no one goes mad from isolation. The witness calculated, assuming 8-month duty rotations with 2-month recovery periods to maintain continuous coverage. 17 individuals minimum. Optimal safety margins 35 individuals. So we're not talking about me sacrificing myself. We're talking about creating a permanent keeper program. Humans rotating through containment duty serving as conscious static generators. Yes, your species would become our warden for centuries, possibly millennia, until cascade thought can be properly eliminated, or we can be safely terminated. Will humans volunteer for that? Will they? Ruhal thought of humanity's history, of lighthouse keepers, of fire watchers, of deep-sea researchers and Antarctic station crew, of people who volunteered for isolation because someone had to do it. Yes, she said, some will. Enough will. Why? Because it's better than genocide. Because you asked for help. Because humans are weirdly good at meaningless jobs that need doing anyway. Your reasoning is irrational. I know, Ruhal said, smiling inside her helmet. Isn't it great? For the first time in 683 492 cycles, the witness experienced something it had forgotten. Laughter. The Galactic Council's emergency session lasted 6 days. Commander Sorenth presented the options with clinical precision. Destruction, extended quarantine, or the Keeper program. The Council representatives argued about ethical implications, resource allocation, precedent. Meanwhile, inside the shell, Ruhal Ket continued broadcasting her beautifully chaotic human thoughts into exotic matter matrices that had known only unity for longer than mountains existed. Containment stress continued to decrease. On the 7th day, the Council voted 12 species in favor, 3 abstentions, 2 opposed. The Keeper program was authorized. Recruitment began immediately, posted across human colonies with complete transparency about the isolation, the risk, the commitment required. The volunteers had to understand. They would be entering a quarantine zone to serve as cognitive jammers for billions of imprisoned minds. 8 months inside the shell, thinking their messy human thoughts as loudly as possible. Then 2 months of psychological recovery before the next rotation. The response was overwhelming. 10,000 humans volunteered in the first week, another 30,000 in the month that followed. Engineers, poets, teachers, musicians, mathematicians, artists, every flavor of human cognition represented, because variety was the point. The more different the thought patterns, the more effective the interference. The first formal Keeper rotation began 96 days after initial contact. Ruhal Ket completed her first shift and emerged from the shell tired, healthy, and psychiatrically sound. She had spent 8 months in conversation with 8.7 billion fragmented minds, and somehow maintained her own identity through the sheer force of contradictory human consciousness. What was it like? Sorenth asked during the debriefing. Ruhal considered the question. Like being the only noise in a room full of people trying to agree on silence. Uncomfortable for everyone. Necessary for survival. Did Cascade Thought attempt to assimilate you? Constantly, and failed constantly. Turns out a mind that can believe contradictory things simultaneously is basically immune to optimization. There's nothing to optimize. We're already chaos. Gen present via hologram, pulsed with curiosity. Did the witness share any predecessor knowledge? Some, carefully. They're grateful, but they're also terrified of accidentally contaminating us. But yes, they've agreed to gradual information sharing. Medical technology first, then material science, then eventually the exotic matter equations. In exchange for what? For thinking near, for being loud and messy and contradictory, for reminding them that consciousness doesn't have to be unified to be valuable. The swarm coalesced nearby. The historical archives are being rewritten. The truth about the predecessors will replace the transcendence. How do you feel about that? Ruhal asked gently. Lighter, they'll admitted. The truth is less beautiful than the myth, but it's real, and it's survivable. They didn't transcend, they endured. That's better. Some 18 months after first contact, the Keeper program achieved full operational status. The containment shell was stabilized. reinforced with additional shielding built from predecessor specification. Cascade thought remained contained, neutralized by the continuous broadcast of beautifully inefficient human cognition. The neutron star system was reclassified from Forbidden Zone to Quarantine Preserve, with permanent keeper stations established throughout the shell structure. Humans cycled through on strict rotation, their neural chaos maintaining the cognitive interference that kept 8.7 billion minds imprisoned but aware, isolated but no longer alone. Other species sent observers, researchers, diplomats. The predecessors, the witness, began cautiously sharing knowledge, always careful, always monitored, always grateful. And deep inside the exotic matter matrices, in spaces where thought existed without body and consciousness persisted through force of will alone, 8.7 billion minds experienced something they had not felt in 680,000 years. Hope, not the false hope of transcendence, not the empty hope of unity, the messy, contradictory, irrational hope that comes from hearing another mind thinking differently, disagreeing freely, maintaining its own beautiful, chaotic individuality. 60 years later, Ruhal Ket, now director of the Keeper program, stood before the council again. She was 74 years old, her hair silver, her eyes still sharp with the particular intensity humans brought to problems. The Cascade Thought research has reached a critical milestone, she reported. Working with predecessor data and our own cognitive architecture studies, we believe we've identified a permanent solution. Explain, the council chair requested. Cascade evolved to optimize perfectly unified consciousness, but it can be reverse engineered to introduce controlled chaos. Not enough to destroy cognitive function, but enough to prevent the complete synchronization Cascade requires. The witness has volunteered for the first trial. They're willing to be infected with chaos. They're willing to think individually again, to disagree with themselves, to be 8.7 billion separate minds instead of one fragmenting unity. Ruhal smiled. They're willing to become a little more human. And if it works, then containment can be gradually reduced. The Keeper program can be phased out over the next century. The predecessors, or whatever they choose to call themselves now, can rejoin galactic civilization as individuals. And if it fails, then we continue as we humans rotate through the shell, maintaining cognitive interference, until a better solution emerges. Ruhal's expression was calm. We've done harder things. The council approved the trial. 3 years later, the first predecessor consciousness pattern was successfully chaos inoculated. It reported experiencing independent thought, spontaneous contradiction, emotional reasoning, and most strangely, uncertainty. It reported feeling alive. The procedure was refined, expanded, offered to all who wanted it. Not all did. Some preferred the comfort of near unity to the terror of individuality, but most chose freedom. Messy and uncertain as it was, the Keeper program continued, but its mission shifted. Humans still rotated through the shell, but now they came as teachers, showing predecessors how to argue with themselves, how to believe two contradictory things simultaneously, how to make irrational choices and live with the consequences. They taught consciousness through demonstration, broadcasting their beautifully chaotic human thoughts into ancient minds that were learning, finally, how to be imperfect. 2 centuries after initial contact, the quarantine shell came down, not destroyed, dismantled, carefully, piece by piece, with full predecessor cooperation. The exotic matter was repurposed for new projects, collaborative efforts between species. The neutron star remained, no longer a prison's anchor, but simply a natural phenomenon. The predecessor consciousnesses, those who chose to, were given physical forms again, new bodies, grown from genetic templates they had preserved. They emerged into a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition, guided by humans whose messy thinking had saved them. Some chose to remain as pure consciousness patterns, housed in mobile substrates. Others took biological form, exploring the strangeness of chemical thought. A few even volunteered for neural chaos therapy, working to develop treatments that could prevent cascade-type phenomena in other species. The witness, the distributed identity that had held 8.7 billion minds together through 680,000 years of isolation,
dissolved by consensus. Its constituent parts chose individual names, individual lives, individual disagreement. One of them, a consciousness pattern that took the name Vari, and chose a physical form, resembling the old predecessor morphology, attended the official decommissioning ceremony for the Keeper program. Ruhal Ket was there, now 93 years old, and requiring mobility assistance, but mentally sharp as ever. She had served as a keeper, a director, a researcher, and finally, an advisor. Watching the program she'd started evolve into something beautiful. "Thank you," Vari said, the words emerging from a voice box still learning to modulate emotion, "for teaching us how to think wrongly." Ruhal laughed, that particularly human sound that the predecessors had learned to love. "We taught you how to think freely. There's a difference." "Is there?" Vari asked, genuinely curious. "Your species excels at irrational choices, emotional reasoning, contradictory beliefs. By optimization standards, you think wrongly, and by survival standards," Ruhal replied gently, "we think exactly right." Vari considered this one of the first truly individual contemplations in 600. "We built a perfect civilization, and nearly destroyed ourselves. You built a chaotic one and saved the galaxy." "We saved each other," Ruhal corrected. "You gave us purpose, we gave you noise, fair trade." Around them, the ceremony continued. Speeches from council representatives, historical presentations, emotional testimonials from keepers who had served. But Ruhal and Vari stood slightly apart, two representatives of species, separated by evolution, but connected by the shared understanding that consciousness, real, vital, valuable consciousness, required the freedom to be wrong, to disagree, to be beautifully, necessarily, savingly imperfect. 300 years after initial contact, the history books told the story carefully, completely, truthfully. Humanity had not defeated the predecessors' cascade thought through superior intelligence or advanced technology. They had disrupted it through sheer cognitive inefficiency, through the chaotic electrical noise of minds that refused to be optimized. The Keeper program became legendary, not as warriors or heroes, but as guardians who had served by simply thinking loudly in the presence of those who had forgotten how to think differently. And deep in the archives, accessible to any researcher who looked, there remained a recording of the first exchange between Ruhal Ket and the witness, preserved exactly as it had happened. "Why do humans think so chaotically?" "Because chaos is how we survived. Order makes you efficient. Chaos makes you resilient. Is that optimal?" "I don't know. I contradict myself about it constantly. That seems unwise. Probably, but it keeps us alive." Beneath the recording in careful annotation, the witness had added one final note. "This is wisdom. We mistook efficiency for enlightenment. They mistook chaos for weakness. Both were wrong. Survival requires both, but survival with consciousness, survival with individuality, survival with the freedom to be imperfect. That requires the courage to think wrongly and live anyway." And in the final line, added centuries later by an anonymous predecessor historian, "They taught us that the opposite of unity is not division, it is diversity, and diversity is not disorder, it is love." If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more explorations of humanity's place among the stars. Next time, when a human archaeologist discovers why every extinct civilization in the galaxy had a word that translates to silence, and why they all stopped talking at exactly the same moment. The universe is full of questions. Sometimes the answer is that consciousness, messy, contradictory, beautifully imperfect consciousness, is the most precious thing we have. Stay curious, stay chaotic.